Welcome to the deep dive. I want you to picture this. It is mid-June 2026.
Right.
And if you walk into the offices of the world's top economists right now, they aren't looking at stock tickers.
No, definitely not.
They aren't looking at bond yields either. They are frantically refreshing meteorological satellite maps,
Yeah.
just staring at clouds.
Mm.
Or, well, the terrifying lack of them.
Yeah, which is the absolute definition of an unconventional leading indicator. I mean, when the financial dashboards fail to capture a real-time crisis, you have to look at the physical world.
Exactly.
Right now, atmospheric moisture over the Indian subcontinent is really the only data point that matters.
And that is the reality we're exploring with you today. We have a massive stack of sources in front of us: climatology reports, historical macroeconomic data, agricultural yield projections, and geopolitical risk assessments.
It's a lot of material.
It is, and our mission is to unpack this incredibly alarming convergence of events. We're looking at a confirmed super El Nino colliding head-on with a massive geopolitical supply shock.
A literal worst-case scenario.
Right. Specifically, the cascading nightmare of a Strait of Hormuz blockade happening at the exact same moment the weather turns against us.
And, the data we are going to walk through reads like a doomsday thriller.
Mm-hmm.
But understanding the mechanics of these converging crises is, well, it's the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed about the global economy's immediate future.
Yeah.
Because when you understand how a weather anomaly interacts with a shipping bottleneck, you can anticipate outcomes way before they hit the evening news.
So we are going to trace the entire domino effect for you. Imagine how a temperature shift in the Pacific Ocean spirals into global stagflation, rewires international trade, alters the literal price of the food on your plate, and forces millions to migrate just to survive.
It touches everything.
It really does. So let's look at the immediate panic happening right now over the Indian subcontinent. The sources point out that satellite imagery from India, the US, and Japan shows a highly unusual lack of cloud activity across India.
Yeah, the maps are essentially blank.
Which leads to my immediate question. Why are financial analysts trying to be meteorologists? Don't governments publish official monthly rainfall data?
Well, they do, but waiting for a monthly report in agriculture means reading the autopsy rather than monitoring the patient.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Economists use satellite cloud maps as a real-time, high-frequency leading indicator because of the strict temporal window of Indian agriculture. We're talking about the Kharif season, the summer monsoon crop.
And this is the main sowing season, right? So the biological window must be incredibly narrow.
It's extremely narrow. The sowing window for critical Kharif crops, paddy, soybeans, cotton, pulses, it's heavily concentrated in the weeks of June and July.
Okay.
So if the satellite maps show no clouds over the subcontinent during this specific window, no rain is falling on the soil, and without deep soil moisture, seeds just cannot be sown.
And what if a farmer just takes a gamble and sows them anyway?
They won't germinate. They will simply bake in the dirt. It's a total loss.
Man, it makes me think of retail. Imagine a retailer's holiday shopping season. If a department store misses Black Friday foot traffic, the year's balance sheet is effectively ruined.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. For these farmers, if the seeds don't get the specific volume of water they need right now, a massive downpour in late August is completely useless. The biological window has closed.
The temporal sensitivity is absolute. So economists are tracing a mechanical chain reaction here. An empty sky today guarantees delayed sowing tomorrow.
Which mathematically guarantees lower yields at harvest time.
Exactly.
And lower yields mean a sudden drop in the supply of daily food staples, which triggers immediate violent spikes in food inflation.
And when food inflation spikes in a developing economy, it corners the central bank.
The Reserve Bank of India, right? The RBI.
Yes. They have a strict mandate to fight that inflation.
So their hands are tied.
Basically. They are forced to keep interest rates high or hike them further to cool down the overall economy.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, by keeping interest rates high, borrowing becomes expensive across the board. Businesses can't expand, corporate debt becomes harder to service, mortgages get more expensive.
So the national economy just slows down.
It grinds to a halt. An empty sky in June dictates a sluggish national GDP in December.
That's wild. The sources also emphasize something called the rural consumption engine.
A massive factor.
So put yourself in the shoes of an urban listener, right?
Yeah.
You're sitting in a high-rise in Mumbai or New York working in tech. Why should you care if the rural crop fails? How does a bad harvest actually hit the broader corporate economy?
It comes down to the sheer scale of the rural consumer base. It is staggering. A massive percentage of the Indian population derives its income directly or indirectly from agriculture.
Okay.
When a crop fails, that entire demographic instantly loses its disposable income. They enter survival mode.
So they stop buying entirely. It's a massive demand shock.
Exactly. The rural population is the foundational consumer base for fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG.
Like soaps, packaged foods, stuff like that.
Basic household items, yeah. If rural income collapses, the profit margins of multinational FMCG companies collapse simultaneously.
I see.
And the automotive sector is brutally impacted too. Sales of two-wheelers and tractors plummet.
So an urban stockbroker looking at the Nifty 50 index needs to monitor those clouds.
Oh, absolutely, because corporate earnings across half the economy are tethered to the purchasing power of the farmer.
The ground reality from the 2026 statistics in our sources is incredibly grim. The India Meteorological Department initially predicted a 92% long-period average.
Which is slightly below normal, but, not catastrophic.
Right. But the actual reality on the ground from June 4th to June 18th showed a massive 41% national rainfall deficit.
And that 41% deficit is hitting exactly during the critical Black Friday window of sowing.
The worst possible time.
The monsoon arrived late in Kerala, and then its progress stalled completely. Now, reservoirs entered the season at roughly 41% capacity, offering a minor buffer for highly irrigated regions.
But the core rain-fed agricultural belts.
Central, western, and peninsular India, they are completely exposed. They rely entirely on the sky.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the data is flashing code red, and the economists see it, why isn't the general public panicking?
That's a fascinating psychological quirk.
Right, because when you walk down the street in a major city, people aren't acting like a food crisis is weeks away.
Huh?
This transitions into the psychology of how humans perceive weather.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people might assume this super El Nino is just media hype.
Well, it is vital to separate media forecasting from active, measurable observation. El Nino is measured by the Ocean Nino Index, the ONI.
Okay.
This index tracks sea surface temperature anomalies in the central equatorial Pacific Ocean. Historically, a normal El Nino is declared when those temperatures rise 0.5 degrees Celsius above the historical average.
Half a degree sounds negligible.
I know, but in terms of oceanic thermal mass, it is an enormous amount of energy. Now, the term super El Nino is a colloquial designation climatologists use when that index crosses a much higher threshold, plus 2.0 degrees Celsius.
4 times the threshold of a standard event.
Exactly. And the reality of mid-June 2026 is that satellite data shows ocean temperatures surging past the historic records of the devastating 1997 and 2015 El Nino events.
Wow.
Furthermore, the Indian Ocean dipole is neutral.
Let's break down the Indian Ocean dipole for a second. How does that normally work?
Think of it as a temperature fluctuation across the Indian Ocean. When it's in a positive phase, the western part of the ocean is warmer, which pushes moisture-laden winds toward India.
So it acts as a shield against El Nino.
Sometimes, yes, against the drying effects. But currently, the dipole is neutral. It is offering zero atmospheric protection. The data is absolute.
This brings us to a brilliant psychological insight from the sources called the density illusion. Humans track the frequency of rain, not the volume.
Yes. The human eye is easily fooled by superficial weather patterns.
Okay.
We are frankly very bad at perceiving slow-moving systemic environmental crises.
I have to admit, when I first read about the density illusion, I pushed back. How could millions of people miss a severe, crop-destroying drought?
It sounds impossible.
Right. But then I thought about it like a paycheck. Imagine getting paid in pennies every single day instead of your full salary at the end of the month.
Okay, I like this.
Your pockets physically feel full all the time. You hear the jingling. You feel like money is constantly coming in. But when the first of the month hits, you can't pay the rent.
That is the density illusion in practice. During a weak monsoon, the rain doesn't just permanently stop. It might drizzle lightly 3 days a week in a city.
Yeah.
And for an urbanite, the streets are wet, the temperature drops slightly, they carry an umbrella, their brain registers rainy season, they assume everything is normal.
But the agricultural data requires volume, millimeters of water.
Exactly. The topsoil might look damp to a commuter on a highway, but the deep soil moisture required for root systems to survive is absent, and the sheer cubic volume of water needed to refill massive regional reservoirs. also absent.
So the total volume is way down.
The total volume might be down 40%, but because it drizzled on Tuesday, the public thinks the crisis is exaggerated.
El Nino also causes severe geographic chaos, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It alters global atmospheric circulation, creating patchy distribution.
Right, so one city might experience a sudden severe cloudburst, dumping a month's worth of rain in 6 hours. And what does the local media cover?
The floods.
They show footage of flooded streets and submerged cars, visually reinforcing the public perception of heavy rains.
Meanwhile, the critical agricultural belt 100 kilometers away is experiencing a devastating weeks-long dry spell.
And this timing mismatch is exacerbated by break monsoons.
Yes, El Niño is notorious for causing these extended dry spells right in the middle of the season.
And if those breaks hit exactly during the June-July sowing window,
The seeds die. The truly insidious part is that heavy rains might finally arrive in late September.
too late for the crops.
Way too late. But that late rain will bring the season's total statistical rainfall up to normal levels on paper.
So a government official can point to a chart in October and claim 100% of average rainfall was achieved.
The data will show a statistically normal year, but the agricultural yield will reflect a severe drought because the rain arrived when the crops were already dead.
Wow.
Without monitoring the aggregate data measuring millimeter volume, reservoir levels, and regional distribution, the human eye sees wet pavement and concludes El Niño was a rumor.
Okay, so we have established a severe weather shock, a massive yield-side problem. But our sources warn of a converging crisis.
The geopolitical side.
Yeah. We are also facing the geopolitical reality of 2026, a Strait of Hormuz blockade choking off global energy and fertilizer supplies.
Which changes everything.
Right. To understand what happens when a massive energy shock meets a massive agricultural shock, we have to look backward.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the macroeconomic nightmare we are looking at in 2026 has a highly accurate historical analog. We have to look at the 1970s.
Specifically the 1973 to 1975 period.
It is the closest blueprint we have for a simultaneous energy and agricultural supply shock.
Because the early 70s saw the end of the post-World War II economic expansion. We had the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries halting oil shipments to nations supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War.
Colliding simultaneously with severe global crop failures.
And the oil shock was staggering. Oil quadrupled from roughly $2.90 a barrel to $11.65 a barrel almost overnight.
Imagine the price of everything that requires transport instantly quadrupling. This dual shock of skyrocketing energy and surging food prices completely shattered the prevailing economic consensus.
And that consensus was the Phillips curve, right? The prevailing theory that inflation and unemployment moved in opposite directions.
Yes, macroeconomic policy treated it as a trade-off. If a government wanted low unemployment, they accepted slightly higher inflation because people had more money to spend.
Makes sense on paper.
Right. And if they wanted to kill inflation, they slowed the economy, raising unemployment.
It was a seesaw. But 1973 broke the seesaw.
Completely. The global economy entered stagflation, stagnant growth, high unemployment, and roaring inflation simultaneously.
Which paralyzed central banks completely.
Think of a central bank like a driver in a car. Suddenly, the steering wheel interest rates is detached from the tires, which represent unemployment.
Oh, man.
Hitting the brakes to slow down inflation just causes the engine to catch fire. If they cut rates to stimulate the shrinking economy, food and energy inflation spiraled further.
A lose-lose situation.
And if they hiked rates to kill inflation, they worsened the recession, bankrupted businesses, and pushed unemployment even higher.
The reactions of specific nations to this trap are a massive warning for us today. The United States' response was heavily criticized in the sources.
Well, the U.S. instituted domestic price controls and rationing schemes.
And when you try to artificially cap the price of a globally scarce commodity, the supply simply vanishes from the shelves.
Exactly.
That directly caused the infamous historical photos of miles-long lines at gas stations.
Because price controls do not create more oil, they create shortages and black markets.
Right.
The sheer trauma of that shock did eventually force structural changes, prompting the creation of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve and permanently altering the auto industry as consumers shifted to fuel-efficient Japanese imports.
And Japan took a completely different path. As an island nation importing nearly all of its energy, they were incredibly vulnerable.
Japan was economically devastated initially, But instead of relying solely on price controls, the Japanese government fundamentally restructured its entire economy.
How so?
They pivoted aggressively away from oil-intensive heavy industry toward high-tech precision manufacturing.
Oh, that makes sense.
They also mandated strict industrial energy efficiency standards and rapidly accelerated their nuclear power grid to detach from fossil fuel dependence.
France recognized the same profound vulnerability to Middle Eastern oil. They launched the Mesmer Plan, an immediate state-led initiative to transition their electrical grid almost entirely to nuclear power.
While wealthy nations eventually adapted, the sources highlight a much darker legacy: the petrodollar trap.
Right, which completely rewired global wealth.
Middle Eastern oil exporters experienced massive overnight booms. OPEC's combined current account surplus jumped from $10 billion in 1973 to $65 billion in 1974.
That is an unimaginable amount of liquid cash flooding into a few nations.
They deposited these massive windfalls, petrodollars, into Western commercial banks in New York and London.
And those banks needed to earn interest on mountains of cash, so they aggressively recycled it, lending those petrodollars to developing nations.
The developing nations were forced to take those loans just to buy the newly expensive oil and food. They were borrowing to afford daily survival.
So they avoided immediate mass starvation in the 70s, but built up an unsustainable mountain of sovereign debt.
Exactly. And when inflation forced central banks to eventually raise interest rates, the variable rates on those loans skyrocketed.
Crushing them.
By the early 1980s, developing nations could not service the debt, triggering the catastrophic Third World debt crises, a lost decade of development.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We take those exact lessons from the 1970s, the stagflation, the debt traps, the central bank paralysis, and apply them to the 2026 scenario.
Right.
We have a classic black swan event, a simultaneous supply-side collapse of energy and fertilizer due to the Strait of Hormuz blockade, hitting exactly as the Super El Niño destroys agricultural yields.
It is the ultimate systemic failure. You are choking off the inputs required to grow food while dealing with weather that prevents food from growing.
Let's break down the hyperinflationary spikes on daily essentials. The sources use the term crisis pricing. El Niño traditionally causes severe droughts in Southeast Asia, India, and Australia, the global breadbaskets for rice and wheat.
In a normal weather shock, farmers compensate by applying more fertilizer to maximize the yield of whatever crops survive. But the Strait of Hormuz blockade is choking off natural gas and oil.
Wait, how exactly does natural gas tie into fertilizer?
Through the Haber-Bosch process.
Okay, walk me through that.
Natural gas is the primary feedstock for creating nitrogen fertilizers like urea. You extract hydrogen from the natural gas and combine it with nitrogen from the air under extreme heat and pressure to create ammonia.
Which is then synthesized into solid urea.
Exactly. If you cut off the natural gas supply, the fertilizer supply chain physically breaks down.
No gas, no urea, no crops. The surviving crops are severely stunted.
Yep.
You have a massive yield drop from the weather, compounded by a massive yield drop from the lack of fertilizer. Global spot prices for rice, wheat, and corn double or triple rapidly.
And palm oil and soybean oil yields plummet due to weather disruptions, causing severe inflation in cooking oils.
This affects the baseline caloric intake of billions of people. But the sources outline a deeply counterintuitive timeline for meat prices, called the meat paradox.
This is fascinating.
If grains are failing, logic suggests meat prices would instantly shoot up as well.
But the mechanics of livestock farming create a very different trajectory. Livestock cattle, poultry, pigs rely entirely on sheep feed grains, primarily corn and soy.
Right.
When global grain prices triple, the daily cost to feed a herd becomes astronomically higher than the market value of the animals themselves.
The farmers can't afford to keep the animals alive.
So they cull the herds prematurely. They send them to slaughter immediately. It is the only mathematically viable choice.
Wow.
This creates a sudden, massive supply of meat hitting the market simultaneously. For a brief window of a few months, you see a meat surplus. Prices at the butcher might even drop.
But once that initial cold supply is eaten, the breeding stock is gone.
The herds have been decimated. That brief illusion of abundance is followed by a prolonged, multi-year period of extreme protein shortages and massive inflation for meat and dairy.
Because it takes years to rebuild a cattle herd.
Exactly.
When abstract prices double or triple, the human toll becomes devastatingly real. Let's look at the demographics at risk. Who actually starves when prices surge?
The data pinpoints the urban poor in import-dependent developing nations as the most vulnerable demographic, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America.
Why the urban core specifically? Aren't rural areas statistically poorer in these regions?
Generally, yes, but there is a crucial distinction in survival mechanics here. The rural poor, even with very little cash, often have access to subsistence farming.
Ah, I see.
They can grow a meager amount of calories, forage, or rely on local village barter networks. The urban poor produce absolutely zero food. They rely entirely on cash to purchase calories from markets.
The sources note these populations already spend 50% to 70% of their total income just on daily calories during normal times. Think about that math.
It's precarious.
If you spend 70% of your paycheck on food and the price of food doubles, you are mathematically pushed below the caloric survival threshold instantly. You do not have the income elasticity to absorb a 100% price increase on rice.
Let's contextualize this with World Bank statistics. Extreme poverty is defined as living on under $2.15 a day, representing roughly 9% of the global population.
Boy.
Lower middle poverty is living on under $3.55 a day, adding another massive segment, bringing the cumulative total to roughly 24% of the global population.
Approximately 1/4 of humanity, roughly 2 billion people.
2 billion people who live in a state where a doubling of staple food prices instantly translates into severe malnutrition.
And if you extend the analysis to the upper middle poverty line of $6.85 a day, nearly 47% of the planet lacks the financial buffer to absorb this dual shock.
Almost half the human race.
So for the rural populations facing this vanished monsoon, what are the daily survival strategies? When the sky is empty in June, they can't just sit and watch the dirt dry.
No, they can't. It requires a forced, rapid shift in agricultural planning. Farmers and regional governments must actively abandon their preferred, high-value, water-intensive staples.
Like paddy, rice requires an enormous amount of standing water.
If the monsoon fails, planting paddy is throwing seeds into a fire. To prevent total starvation, they are forced to shift to lower-yield, highly drought-resistant crops.
Like what?
Millets, sorghum, and resilient legumes. These crops have vastly different biological requirements. Their root systems can extract sparse, patchy moisture left in the soil.
So it's essentially a triage strategy.
You accept a massive financial loss because millets sell for a fraction of the price of rice, but you guarantee that something edible grows.
Watching their citizens face starvation, governments naturally intervene. The obvious question is, why can't governments just subsidize the food and fertilizer?
Right, just bail everyone out.
Yeah, just cap the prices, give out free grain, and absorb the cost at the state level to avoid a famine.
This raises an important question, but this is where macroeconomic reality becomes ruthless. When governments intervene with massive, unbudgeted subsidies for food and fertilizer, the fiscal consequences trigger what economists call a subsidy death spiral.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of that spiral. How does a government accidentally destroy its own economy trying to feed its people?
Step 1. The government must borrow heavily at high interest rates to fund the subsidies, blowing out their fiscal deficits and taking on enormous sovereign debt.
They borrow the money, but they still have to buy the actual food and fertilizer on the global market.
Step 2 involves foreign exchange. Global commodities are priced and traded in U.S. dollars. Developing nations must use their foreign exchange reserves to buy these imports.
And because global prices have doubled or tripled, they rapidly burn through their national dollar reserves.
Exactly. And when the forex reserves run empty, the central bank can no longer defend its currency.
Step 3 is currency collapse.
The local currency plummets in value against the dollar. It might take twice as many local rupees or pesos to buy one U.S. dollar. This causes imported inflation.
Because the local currency is worth less globally, the government has to print more local currency just to buy the exact same amount of subsidized grain.
Yes. Flooding the domestic market with newly printed money triggers a vicious inflationary spiral. The attempt to subsidize the food actually causes the underlying currency to collapse, making the food exponentially more expensive in real terms. It's a fiscal trap.
The sources map out the cascading second and third order effects of this trap on global trade. First is food nationalism.
Producing nations panic over domestic supply and enact strict export bans. India might ban rice exports. Argentina might ban wheat.
They build walls around their food, instantly reducing global supply further and causing prices in import-dependent nations to explode again.
Then we see demand destruction. Because natural gas is scarce due to the blockade, governments ration it purely for basic heating and critical fertilizer production.
leaving industry with nothing.
Entire industrial sectors, manufacturing, chemicals are forced to shut down because they cannot access energy. The economy grinds to a halt.
Which leads to sovereign defaults. When debt becomes unsustainable, the currency collapses and the economy stops. Emerging markets default on international debt.
The 2022 crisis in Sri Lanka is a perfect preview. A combination of currency collapse, lost tourism, and a disastrous ban on chemical fertilizers led to total sovereign default and the overthrow of the government.
That street-level reality is terrifying. A collapsed currency isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It means a doubling of the price of bread overnight. And historically, that is the exact moment society breaks.
The sources warn that food inflation is history's greatest trigger for civil unrest.
You can have high unemployment or political scandals, and societies generally remain stable. When the price of daily calories doubles, civil society fractures.
The Arab Spring in 2011 is a prime example. Widely covered as a democratic political awakening, the immediate trigger in many nations, particularly Egypt, was severe wheat shortages and skyrocketing bread prices.
The predictions for a 2026 dual shock scenario are widespread urban riots, looting of supermarkets, and massive strikes.
Trust in democratic institutions evaporates rapidly. Citizens facing starvation reject slow, deliberative democratic processes.
They gravitate toward authoritarian populists, promising immediate security, border control, and most importantly, subsidized bread.
Civil society breaks down into intense class warfare. The middle class is wiped out, pushed into poverty as savings are destroyed by inflation. The ultra-wealthy retreat to highly secured, self-sustaining enclaves.
When local institutions collapse, people move with their feet, and capital moves with its wallet. Food scarcity drastically shifts the nature of migration. We're no longer talking about economic migration for a better job.
No, this is survival migration. People moving simply to stay alive.
The logistics of survival migration start internally. We see a massive rural-to-urban flight. Bankrupt farmers, whose crops have failed and who have exhausted local credit, flee to capital cities seeking emergency food aid.
Which puts unsustainable pressure on urban centers already dealing with rioting and hyperinflation.
And internationally, we see a massive surge in south-to-north migration. Millions of desperate people attempt to migrate toward regions perceived to have stability in food, crossing the Mediterranean into Europe, or moving toward the southern border of the United States.
The reporting remains impartial on the politics, but traces the causal reaction of developed nations. Developed nations in the global north will be suffering through their own stagflation, high energy costs, shrinking economies, angry domestic populations.
The geopolitical reaction follows historical patterns. Aggressive militarization of borders, suspension of asylum laws, deployment of military forces, and potentially the use of naval blockades to physically stop the influx of survival migrants.
Political tolerance for immigration drops to zero when domestic populations feel economically threatened.
Let's look at how global stock markets process this dual shock. We established the traditional dashboard is broken. What does a stagflationary market crash actually look like?
It is a brutal narrowing of the market. Broad indices like the S&P 500 or the Nifty 50 will be crushed. In a normal recession, the central bank cuts interest rates, money gets cheap, and the stock market rallies.
But in stagflation, they cannot cut rates because inflation is roaring.
High interest rates, a frozen global economy, and squeezed corporate margins destroy broad equity valuations.
Consumer discretionary stocks are devastated. Retail, travel, luxury goods. The global middle class spends all available capital on basic survival: food, energy, housing. Airlines and logistics companies are crushed by the astronomical cost of jet fuel and diesel.
But capital always finds a place to hide.
Massive capital flight flows into highly specific, hardened sectors. The brutal winters, agricultural commodities become incredibly valuable. Defense contractors see huge inflows as nations militarize borders.
Energy producers located outside the Middle East see massive premiums. And crucially, fertilizer companies located in regions with abundant domestic natural gas supplies like North America become incredibly strategic assets.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at nervous economists staring at satellite maps of an empty sky over India.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've traced how a lack of clouds is mechanically connected to Pacific Ocean temperatures, to Middle Eastern geopolitical choke points, to the ghosts of 1970s stagflation, and ultimately to the daily survival of billions.
Our modern global economy is an intricate, fragile web. The invisible supply chains bringing food to our tables and energy to our homes rely on a delicate balance of favorable weather, geopolitical stability, and cheap credit.
When those pillars are kicked out simultaneously, the system fractures. We've covered the biological imperatives of agricultural yields, the devastating caloric math of the urban poor, the physical death spiral of government subsidies, and the logistics of survival migration.
Understanding these mechanisms is how we navigate what comes next.
Throughout this discussion, we returned to the 1970s. The sheer panic of those energy and food shocks forced incredible, permanent structural evolution. It birthed the modern energy efficiency movement, Japan's high-tech pivot, and France's resilient nuclear grid.
Crises of this magnitude force adaptation.
If the 2026 Super El Nino and global supply bottlenecks truly come to pass, what permanent structural revolution might this crisis force upon our world today? Will it accelerate a total detachment from fossil fuel-dependent agriculture?
Or will it force a revolution in hyperlocal, climate-controlled food production?
And on a personal level, how vulnerable is your own daily life to a breakdown in these invisible global supply chains? It's a question you need to ponder as you look at the weather outside your window. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time.